الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله على رسول الله أما بعد. So previously we did the introduction in which we talked about uh, the prophecy of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam about how innovations in Islam and innovations in deen will prevail at the end of times. And just as Islam began as a stranger in its initial stages, it will soon turn out to be a stranger once more. Now we know through his prophecy that this is going to happen. But what exactly is this bid'ah that we're talking about and we keep hearing about everywhere? So the first thing we need to understand is that bid'ah uh, comes from the root words bad'un, bada'a, and that means to innovate and to invent something without a previous blueprint, right? So what bid'ah means is that you didn't have an example, a previous example, you didn't have a blueprint, you knew nothing about it, and you just invented it, right? So that is what bid'ah means. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He's introducing Himself, He explains this in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 177, Badi'u samawati wal ards, that Allah is the one who created the skies and the earth, and there was no previous example of it. And also in Surah Al-Ahqaf, verse number 9, when the pagans of Makkah, they were in disbelief about Prophet ﷺ being a prophet, right? And so the argument that was given to them, وَمَا كُنْتُ بِدْعًا مِنَ الرُّسُلِ, I'm nothing new amongst the Anbiya. There have been so many before me, right? And the mushrikeen of Makkah should have known because they would lived amongst the Ahlul Kitab. And the Ahlul Kitab talked about Anbiya, and Abuhum Ibrahim alayhim salam was also a Nabi min al-Anbiya. So Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam, ma kana bid'ah, he was nothing new. There was previous examples that came before him. So that is the linguistic definition of bid'ah means. So anything which is new, anything which hasn't been seen before, is known as bid'ah. And that's the reason for the more technical term of bid'ah, it's derived from the same meaning. So you introduce something new which isn't known before in the Sharia, in the Deen, and you present it as if it is part of the Deen. So it's something brand new, something totally unknown. Now, whenever we talk about al-ahkam in fiqh and usul al-fiqh, we know that every action that a person does, it has some sort of hukum, some sort of label in the Sharia, right? So our actions are divided into three classes. So number one is that matlubun fi'luhu, we are required or supposed to do it, either in the form of it being farz or wajib, or at the very least in the form of being mustahab, that it is something good that if you do it. So number one is matlubun fi'luhu, that you should do it or you have to do it. Number two is matlubu tarkuhu, that it is required that you leave it. Sometimes it's in the form of being totally forbidden haram, you have to leave it. And sometimes it's just makruh tanzi, the better option is not to do something, right? And then you have matlubun, ay takhirun fi'luhu wa tarkuhu. You have an option of doing it, and you have the option of not doing it, what we call mubah. Right, so that's a third class of action that whether you do it or you don't do it, it's totally up to you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Anbiya have kept quiet. Right? The second category that we talked about, matlubun darbuhu, that which you're required to leave. Now, this can be further divided into two parts, right? So part number one is uh, there's a very specific dalil, very specific verse or hadith, which tells you not to do this act, right? So, for example, take riba or shurbul khamr or zina, right? These are very specific acts. You find specific verses in the Quran telling you that this action is forbidden. You can't do this, right? And someone who does these things is considered an asim, ma'siyah, that he has committed a sin, right? Then there are other types of actions which are matlub tarku that you're not supposed to do, but you don't find specific adillah for them. So the Quran mentions la taqrabu zina, right? فَهَلْ أَنْتُمْ مُنْتَهُونَ. It talks very explicitly about that this action is don't come near it, and this action stop from it. These what if you do it, that's ma'siyah. But then there are those actions which the Quran or the Hadith don't take the name of it and say that don't do this. But rather, if you look at the whole picture, the larger picture, the whole structure of the Sharia, the Quran, the Sunnah, and how the Sahaba treated these things, you'll find that these things are not allowed, right? So, for example, someone decides that I am not going to eat, for example, anything sweet all my life, right? You won't find a very specific situation in the Hadith or the Quran which tells you that making this wajib on yourself of not eating anything sweet, that this is forbidden, you shouldn't do this. But if you look at Sharia in general, you get the image that making something haram on yourself, haram in the first place, is something that the Sharia does not allow. Without mentioning specific examples, the one that I mentioned could be a case of it. So the second category of matlub tarkuhu, and that is the scope of bid'ah. That is bid'ah lies. So if someone does something which, although you don't find a specific belief for it being forbidden, that the general understanding of Islam tells you that it's not okay, committing such an act, that is what constitutes as a bid'ah, right? So the act of inventing this thing is called ibtida'. The whole structure of it is called a bid'ah, and the one who does it is called a mubtadi', right? So what is exactly bid'ah? So bid'ah can be defined as an innovative path in deen that contends with Sharia with similar intentions. Let's break that down. So the first thing that it has is that it's an innovative path, right? So if it's something that's already established, something that you already find happening in the deen, you find it in the Quran, in the Sunnah, in the amal of the Sahaba, radiallahu anhum, then it's not an innovative path. It's not innovative at all, right? It's something that's already being done. So it can be automatically part of the theme. The other part is it mentions the word ad-deen. So it's an innovative path in deen. If it's not in deen, it's not intended to be part of Islam, part of your deen. It's just something brand new, maybe for this of a dunya. Then it's not bid'ah. So inventing the car or electronic devices going to the moon, that's not bid'ah because no one ever intended it to be part of the deen, right? So that's the second thing in the definition that we need to keep an eye out for, right? Uh, and the word path, uh, in Arabic, the word used for is at-tariq or as-sabil, and it means ma rasamahu ash-shari'. So you have boundaries. So it's the pathway you want to go that's to the Jannah, it's at the top. So it's a very specific direction which the Sharia has created, and that is the path, right? And Sirat al-Mustaqim, that's one single path. So you follow it right to your maqsood, your objective, which is Jannah. Now, bid'ah is actually you deviate from that path. So instead of going like this, as you were supposed to, you went ahead to go like this, or any other direction for that matter, right? So you create a path that had not yet existed, and it's part of the deen that's understood. The other thing is that it contends with Sharia. So that new path is competing with the path already established, right? It's at odds with it. So the Sharia path is leading you somewhere, and the Bid'ah path wants to lead you to the same objective. The objective is the same, and yet you're taking a direction which is unknown, or you're taking a direction with the intention of something that it's not necessarily leading you to that place, right? So that's the, and with similar intentions, right? So basically, this new path, this innovative path in the objective of it is to do exactly what you have laid down in Sharia, which is worshiping of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this tells us that al-adat, those things that aren't for the sake of worship, are not part of bid'ah, right? And so from here, you also get what the Usuliyin mentioned about there being two kinds of sunnah. Sunanul huda was sunanul ada. There are some actions of the Prophet alayhi salam, which he did because they were ibadats, they were acts of worship, like praying the sunnah, right? Or going to the mosque to pray, for example, or giving sadaqatul fitr. All of these things are sunnah, right? They're sunnah, and they're acts of worship. Then there were other sunnah which were basically habits of Prophet alayhi salam, and they weren't actually intended to be acts of worship. For example, the way he talked, walked, ate, and sleep, right? So these were habits of the Prophet ﷺ. There's no doubt there's a lot of barakah in that. And scientifically speaking, if you look at his eating habits or sleeping habits, you'll find that they hold lots of medical benefits, right? That whole aspect aside, those things that he did were not primarily acts of worship, right? And if so, if you eat something which the Prophet ﷺ did not used to eat, and then it's not going to be a bid'ah, right? So you and I, if we go ahead and eat uh, white bread or pizza or something like that, that is not a bid'ah, even though those are things which weren't a part of the Prophet ﷺ, neither the Sahaba or the first and second generation in Islam. Radiallahu anhu. So it's only when it comes to ibadat, when we acknowledge that this is a bid'ah or it's not a bid'ah. There is another definition. There is another definition which might include al-adat into the definition of bid'ah as well. That is not something that the majority of the scholars hold in view. So we're not going to discuss that here, right? So an innovative path indeed, which means that if there was a path already, if there's something that has an asl in Sharia, something that has a basis in Sharia, that will not be a bid'ah. For example, all of the Islamic sciences, take the Arabic language, it's been divided into al-nahw, al-sarf, al-balagha, and things like that, right? Or we have usul al-fiqh, fiqh, ilm al-kalam, and all of these different Islamic sciences. One could say that these are bid'ah as well, because in the form that we have them today, they were unavailable at the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba, right? So if I have this book in Hadith, for example, then this should be a bid'ah because these kinds of compilations weren't present at that time. True, but their asl or basis for that, it was still present, right? For example, we know that i'rab al-Quran is manqul. We know that the Prophet ﷺ told the Sahaba to learn Arabic language to the point that they can actually recite and understand the Quran perfectly fine, right? And similarly, learning Arabic language is a necessary tool in order to properly understand the Kitab and Sunnah. So although maybe these things weren't present back then in their form, which they are with us today, but at least their asal was present. Knowing the Arabic language to know the deen, that is something that's mentioned in the Quran. You haven't given a specific path, but at least you have a basis for it. And so those which have a basis cannot be bid'ah. Now one might ask, okay, maybe learning Arabic language is not a bid'ah, but does it have to be in the form of the books that you have today, or in the method of dividing it into subjects like surf and nahw and things like that, etc.? We've already given the answer that it has an asl, it has a basis in Sharia, and the hadith has some indications of allowing such a thing, right? And so you don't have a very specific dalil which says that, there's a verse in the Quran telling you that divide Arabic language into 12 different subjects and then study them. No. But then again, you don't have any sort of dalil for the compilation of the Quran as well. The Quran in the time of the Prophet ﷺ was not present in the form of one single book that it is today. If you, if someone, asks us the dalil of why are these Islamic sciences in the form of books, etc., is this not a bid'ah? Then that person will be asked a very simple question: is the compilation of the Quran in the form of a book bid'ah? Yes or no? If yes, then obviously uh, this is something that nobody agrees with, because it was the Sahaba radiallahu anhum ajma'in who collected the Quran in the form of one single book. And so it's a very brave thing to say that each of the Sahaba, they went astray just right after the death of the Prophet ﷺ because they compiled the Quran in. And so if your answer is no, which it probably is, then that actually means that what kind of dalil would you have? So our question then would be, what dalil do you have which suggests that it is acceptable to collect the Quran in one single compilation? And whatever your answer is the same as ours. And this actually goes back to another principle known as al-masalih al-mursala. A more detailed discussion of this will come later on, inshallah. And this discussion basically clears out everything, distinction between how to define or discern what would be bid'ah and what would be an acceptable innovation. It will come later on. Uh, Allah willing, inshallah. All right, so we talked about some of the parts of the definition, right? We talked about masalih mursala. Sometimes people might call things bid'ah. You might see in the works of scholars that they call something bid'ah, but they don't mean it bid'ah in the sense we're talking about right now, the kind which is forbidden, right? For example, Umar radiallahu anhu, he said, قِيَامُ النَّاسِ فِي اللَّيَالِ Ramadan, right? He said, نِعْمَ بِدْعَ هَذِهِ, that this is a very good bid'ah innovation. As we'll come to know later on, that which the Sahaba introduce is also part of the deen. But the use of bid'ah in these contexts, in context about uh, things that have been happening in the Ummah for so long and it was acceptable, the use of the word bid'ah is not used in this legal definition that we are trying to explain. It's used more as majaz, or you could say it's being used more in its linguistic sense than its legal sense. Allahu a'lam bisawab. Now, bid'ah is something that we know is mukhalif to sunnah, it's against sunnah, but what are the ways in which it differentiates itself from the sunnah, right? So one of the ways is by creating limits and boundaries. So there's an act of worship uh, present in the Quran and the Sunnah, but you introduce new limits and boundaries to it, right? So fasting, for example, in the Sharia is to abstain from three things: abstain from food, drink, and sexual intercourse from sunrise to sunset. That is what fasting entails. That is what the definition of fasting is. Now, a bid'ah over here could be by creating a new limit by saying that I'm not going to talk during my entire fast. So from sunrise to sunset or from dawn to sunset, I'm not going to talk at all. And this will be part of my fast. So by creating a new limit, adding a new boundary, you turn that act of ibadah into a bid'ah because not talking has not been known or has no dalil for it in the Sharia. Similarly, uniforms of, let's say that I adhere to a special fiqh or maybe a special school in Ihsan and Tasawwuf, right? And I stick to a uniform that I'm going to wear just this type of cap and no other type of cap at all. I'm not going to use any other head covering, or I'm just going to wear this type of cloth and I'm not going to wear any type of cloth ever again, right? The Sharia has given you a wide range of things you can wear. As long as there are some certain principles which are being followed, you have the options of wearing whatever you want. So sticking to just one single uniform, that is it and nothing else, that would also be part of a bid'ah, for example. Or if you go on to do Hajj, you say that I'm not gonna stand under the shade at all. In my entire Hajj, I'm gonna perform in open air. So that would also be a bid'ah because this is not understood to be an integral part of Hajj. So that's one way in which bid'ah differentiates itself from sunnah, is that you create new limits and boundaries unknown. Second example is to adhere to specific states and positions, uh, which are not found in the Sharia. For example, الذكر على الاجتماع صوت واحد. So, for example, after salawat, everybody starts to do some sort of zikr, and they all do it in the same voice. For example, maybe they're doing the the shahadatain. So that all of them go, La ilaha illallah. So everybody, the imam, the muqtadi, everybody is saying it on just one thought, on one syllable. So iltizam, adhering to such states, that you're going to do this after every Fajr prayer, after every Maghrib prayer, not going to miss it out, and everybody's going to do it. So adhering to such position, and that could be a bid'ah, right? Or, for example, to make the birth date of the Prophet ﷺ, the 12th of Rabiul Awwal, as a day of Eid, right? So that is also a problem because this is something that had not yet existed. That didn't exist in the time of the Prophet, that didn't exist in the time of the Sahaba radiallahu anhu. The third thing that introduces bid'ah is to adhere to specific acts of worship on very specific dates. For example, take 15th of Sha'ban. So if someone, they take it upon themselves to always fast the 15th of Sha'ban and always spend the night of the 15th of Sha'ban in worship, right? You make it obligatory on yourself and you adhere to this every year. And then this is a problem because there is no specific act of ibadah mentioned for the 15th of Sha'ban. Even the fast, though there's a weak hadith mentioned, that we don't find that the Prophet or the Sahaba radiallahu anhum used to adhere to it. They would sometimes they wouldn't. Same goes for the night. They would worship whatever they could, which they would usually do any other night as well. So there was nothing special about the 15th of Sha'ban for them, right? For this reason, the Fuqaha mentioned that it is makruh for you to specify a single surah for a specific salah all the time. For example, if you make it on yourself, you don't think it's wajib, you don't think it's necessary, but in Maghrib, for example, you always, in the first unit, recite Alam Tara Kaif, and in the second unit, you recite Li'ila fi Quraysh. You always do that. You never recite anything else. So such strict adherence to doing something, even though you're not thinking it's necessary, it is still makruh. It is still forbidden because these things can turn into bid'ah. So these are just very few examples of how a sunnah can transform into a bid'ah. Why do people do that? That is the bigger question. Why would anyone want to do a bid'ah knowing that it is not a part of deen, not part of the sharia? One of the reasons is to increase in ibadah. The person who does bid'ah usually does so because they want to engage in ibadah exclusively, excessively, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that I have not created the jinn and the ins, humans and the jinns, except for my worship. So we know some of the ibadats that the Sharia tells us to do, but this person thinks, well, my purpose of creation is an ibadah, so I'm gonna go full into it. And then in doing so, that person creates things which the Sharia didn't have. Or maybe they start creating boundaries and limits which the Sharia had not prescribed. So their main objective or their intention was to increase their ibadats and their acts of worship, but they went and took on the wrong path. So that's one reason why people involved in bid'ah. The other is fighting boredom, right? Because it's human nature that by doing the same task repeatedly, repetitively, we get bored, right? And so doing ibadats, the same single ibadah day in, day out, that could be something that bores someone. And they could find a bit of malal and sa'am in it, right? And so in order to combat that, what they do is they invent new things. So new forms of ibadat, so they can get more focused and get more engaged. Now their asal intention is good. Their actual intention to increase ibadah, it's very good. But the way they're doing it, that's where the problem is. So fighting boredom. They invent new things so they can engage in ibadah in a fresh manner. And that's what makes it challenging, right? This is where the muhsineen, the top tier mu'mineen, and the bottom tier or the lower tier mu'mineen are differentiated. Is that you do the same single ibadah day in and day out, that which Allah has commanded you, that which is the sunnah of the Prophet, even if you don't want to. Even if you're tired, even if you don't want to drag yourself to the masjid to pray, you do that anyways. That's where the actual ajr hides, right? Because remember, these acts of ibadah, we don't do them just because we feel like doing them or we want to do them. We do them because this is the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So these are the two reasons why people actually choose to do bid'ah, right? One, to increase their forms of ibadah, but they just did something that wasn't okay. The second is to, liven up the situation, introduce something new so they can more easily adhere to that act of ibadah. So this actually also clears out that adat are not part of bid'ah. So anything which is an ada is not bid'ah, right? Because even if you could say that it contains Sharia, it has a way. For example, the Prophet Islam had a certain sleeping habit. You have a different sleeping habit. So sleeping habits, they're the same thing, but the way in which it's being done is totally different. But it's not an act of ibadah in itself. So even though you might have different ways over here, it's okay. It's still not the kind of bid'ah which we're talking about. Now, I want to put on a clarification note is I differentiate between two types of sunnah, sunnah al-ibadah and sunnah al-aada, right? One that was an act of ibadah that the Prophet ﷺ engaged in and asked us to do as well, that we're supposed to do. And the other is sunnah al-aada, which he just did it out of habit, and if we don't do it, it's not a problem. But if someone has the intention of imitating the Prophet ﷺ and he actually follows the adab of the Prophet ﷺ as well, with this intention, then that person will get the ajr of following the sunnah as well. So in itself, not necessary, but with the right intention, you could actually turn your day-to-day into an ibadah just by imitating the Prophet ﷺ. Allahu alam. Bismillah. So all of these new inventions, buildings, books, libraries, transport, chairs, all the things that we're seeing, um, not a problem with them or using them, as long as you don't have any ill intentions or anything else with it. Allahu Akbar bisawab. Now, there's an important note that we must place over here when we're talking about bid'ah. So the definition that we used for bid'ah, this also includes bid'ah at-tarkiyah. So bid'ah is not just doing something in deen. Sometimes it's leaving out that which is deen, right? So it's not just the act of doing that could be classified as bid'ah. It is also the act of not doing something that could be bid'ah as well. And I think this is important to know because usually this isn't talked about as much, right? So that definition of bid'ah, it also includes bid'ah tarkiyah as well. Because we said any innovative way, whether by doing something or by not doing something, that could be bid'ah as well, right? So when you leave something, when you're not doing something, you either aren't doing it because you have some examples in the Sharia, which tells you that you shouldn't do it. For example, you're leaving something and you're not doing something which is permissible for you not to do. A person with diabetes, right, or with sugar, they don't eat anything sweet, and they made it forbidden on themselves that they're not going to eat anything sweet, right? So although eating sweet things, that's not forbidden in the Sharia itself. But the reason why this person is not eating anything sweet is because it's gonna be damaging for him. It's gonna make that person more sick, right? And so, in order to avoid that, that person makes it haram on themselves, the one with diabetes, that I'm not gonna eat anything sweet at all, right? Now that's okay because protecting your health uh, is an example of the things that the Sharia has sanctioned, that the Sharia has allowed. So that is not a problem at all, right? So, for example, in the hadith, the Prophet Islam, he mentioned, يا معشر الشباب من استطاع منكم الباءة فليتزوج. Um, those of you who can marry, youngsters should get married. And at the end of the hadith, he says, من لم يستطع فعليه بالصوم. And those of you who, for some reason, cannot get married at this time, you should fast in order to break down your shahwa and your desires and lust, right? So here the Prophet Islam himself is prescribing that if you cannot marry for some reason, then adopt an alternative for it, right? Although marrying itself is a sunnah, and in some cases it's wajib to get married. But if you can't for whatever reason, if you're choosing to not do this sunnah at this moment, at least adopt a secondary measure, which is going to prevent you from the sin of the farj. Right? So you're either leaving something because, you have examples of it in the Sharia, in which the Sharia allows you to do it. And in that case, it's fine. There's no problem if you are leaving something. On the other hand, you might be leaving something not because you have specific examples and permissions from the Sharia, but you're just leaving it. So that you might either leave it considering it to be part of the deed, or just making it haram on yourself, not really thinking that it's been. For example, I choose not to drink cold water, for example. If I'm choosing that, and I don't think this is some form of ibadah or anything, it's just that I don't do it. So my iltizam, my making this like obligatory on me is completely void of purpose. It's useless. It's just I'm not doing something and I'm making it on me not to do something. Well, there's nothing to it. I couldn't, but I just do it. So that's okay. That's not really a problem either. But if I, for example, consider it to be part of the deen, so I'm not going to drink cold water because, for example, the Nasara do drink cold water, so I'm not going to do that. I make it a part of the deen that by not drinking cold water or by not eating something sweet is as if I'm doing an extra form of ibadah. If that is my intention, that's in my head when I'm not doing these things, that is bid'ah. So when you leave something, when you make something forbidden which is not, and the you have no reason for it. You have no valid reason for it. You have no excuse from the Sharia, no example from the Sharia. You just do it thinking that this is part of the deen. That is where the problem lies, and that is when this thing becomes a bid'ah, right? So, for example, and it's not, it's these things are like tarkul fi'l, not doing something. This can be bid'ah. We know of this from the hadith as well. So three Sahaba, they came to al-Mu'mineen Aisha radiallahu anha. This is a hadith mentioned in Sahih Bukhari and the other books of hadith. And they asked her about what the Prophet used to do, right? And when she told them about the a'mal of the Prophet alayhi salam, the words of the hadith said, "كَأَنَّهُمْ تَقَالُوهَا." They thought this is very less. Like, as if the Prophet's not doing any sort of ibadah at all. And then they were talking with each other, and then they mentioned, well, where are we from the Prophet? He's the one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, that your previous and upcoming, whatever sins that you might do, all have been forgiven. So we're nothing like the Prophet. We need more ibadah. And so each one of them chose a specific thing. One said that, asumu wala uftiru, that I'm just going to fast and fast and fast. I'm not going to break my fast. One of them said, Aqumu layla wa la anam, that I'm just going to pray the entire night. I'm never going to sleep again. And the third one said, that I'm not going to ever get married again. When this event was uh, told, whatever the proceedings to the Prophet ﷺ, he came to them and asked, were you the people who said such and such? And they were said, Naam ya Rasulullah, we didn't. And then the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, Aqumu wa ana, I pray at night and at times I sleep as well. Asumu wa uftir, I fast and sometimes I break my fast, I don't. Wa atazawwaju nisa, and then I get married. And he also mentioned, Inni atqakum, I'm the most fearful among you of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And yet, I'm not adhering to something very specific. Just gonna fast, never gonna break my fast. Just gonna pray all night, never gonna sleep, never gonna get married. So these are things which la ahda biha fi sharia. It's not mentioned in the Quran, it's not the way of the Prophet. And then he mentions the famous words that you've probably heard. فَمَنْ رَغِبَ عَنْ سُنَّتِي فَلَيْسَ مِنِّي. Those who ignore my sunnah or are uninterested in my sunnah, in my way, فَلَيْسَ مِنِّي, he has nothing to do with it. So you have a sunnah, you leave it for something else. The Prophet Islam is washing his hands, dusting his hands off, that I have nothing to do with such a person. And what do you get when you leave a sunnah? Everything that is left is a bid'ah, right? So over here, these three people weren't talking about doing something. They were talking about not doing something, not doing iftar, not sleeping, and not getting married, right? And this is what the Prophet Islam is mentioning. فَمَنْ رَغِبَ عَنْ سُنَّتِي, you're going away from my sunnah, which is to do things, and you're not doing them. So from this hadith, we learn that bid'ah is not just doing things. It can sometimes translate into not doing things. And this is what we mean by bid'ah at-taqiyya. And our definition includes this as well. And so this is something that we should always remember whenever we choose not to do something. First, to see whether or not this is something that the Sharia has told us to do. And second, to check our intentions where we're going with this. Now, might ask the question, well, there are certain matlubat, certain things that the Sharia asks us to do, right? They may either be wajib, they may either be nudub, mustahab. If I leave these matlubat, if I'm not doing those things that the Sharia expects me to do, will I be considered a mubtadi'? Person who is not doing those matlubat, will that person be considered a mubtadi'? Yes or no? Well, the answer to that is those who leave those matlubats, the people who are not doing those things the Sharia expects them to do, are one of two people. One of them is that person is not doing these things because of laziness, or because, they don't really care much about it. So if they're leaving a wajib, so basically they're doing it for psychological reasons, motivation, or something else. So if the thing that they're leaving is wajib, if that matlub was a wajib, then leaving it will be a ma'siyah, it will be a sin. But if it's mustahab, if it is nudub, it is not wajib, and you leave something, if it's juz'iyan, then it's okay, but if it's kulliyan, then it will also be a ma'siyah. What this last line means is, we know you have to do a wajib. You don't really have an option. If you don't do it, you're committing a ma'siyah. But those things that we call mustahab or just sunan, although they're not at the same stage as what farz and wajib is, right? Which means if you don't do it a few times, maybe once or twice, it's okay, not a big deal. But if you're constantly not doing it, then this transforms into a ma'siyah. So, for example, if you're not praying your sunan after Zuhr, you don't pray the 2 units of Zuhr after the farz. If you leave it once or twice, not a big deal. But if you're constantly doing that, you never pray, then this turns into a ma'siyah. And I think that's another thing most of us either don't know about or know about, but we really lack the practice. Is if you know of a sunnah and you're constantly leaving it, you're constantly ignoring it, you never do it, you always leave it, then although initially it wasn't that big of a deal, but your consistency in not doing it transforms into a maksiyah. This is more of a usuli discussion, but just keep that in mind as well. All right, so this was the first kind of person who is leaving these matlubats, leaving what the Sharia expects us to do due to psychological reasons. The second is the one who leaves these things thinking it as part of deen. So I'm not doing a specific mandub, a nafil act or a sunnah because I think that it goes against the Sharia, right? I'm not doing this because I think by not doing this, I'm following the Sharia. And this is exactly the kind of bid'ah that we were talking about, because now you're creating a new way inside of deen. The old way told you to do this sunnah, do this nafil, and your new way tells you not to do them. So you're creating an alternate pathway which contends with the original path. And so this would be a form of bid'ah as well. So whether it's your actions, whether it's your speech, or whether it is your doctrine and beliefs, right? All of these things come in the scope of bid'ah. So sometimes what you do can be a bid'ah, sometimes what you speak and talk about can be a bid'ah, and sometimes what you even believe can come in the scope of bid'ah and can be a bid'ah. So you have to learn exactly whether or not what you do and what you believe in is bid'ah or not. Allahu alam bisawab. Now, if there are any questions, I would be more than happy to take them.